Hello, my name is Alessandra Naududvari. I'm the author of Adventures of Nikki, a juvenile fiction series. The name of my first novel is Nikki and the Lost Templar. It is about the fabled treasure of the Knights Templar, which is supposedly hidden right here in Nova Scotia, maybe even on Oak Island. I decided to reach out to a fellow author, Gretchen Cornwall, who writes non-fiction books about the Knights Templar. Gretchen appeared on the History Channel show the Curse of Oak Island in season 6, where she presented her own Templar theory of Oak Island. The theory ranked among the top 10 on the show, which is quite impressive. Gretchen also made an amazing discovery in the state of Wisconsin, and I can't wait for you to hear about it straight from her. I present to you the very beautiful, smart, and accomplished Gretchen Cornwall. The interview turned out to be quite long, over 2 hours, so I decided to split it into two parts. This is part one. I hope that at the end you will decide to also watch or listen to the part two. Enjoy. Hello, Gretchen.
Hello, Alessandra. Nice to meet you at last.
Nice to meet you as well. How long have we known each other?
I don't even know. It feels like forever. And because we've messaged so often on Facebook, I feel like I already know you. So I'm not at all surprised to see you and your lovely long hair.
Thank you. Well, you look beautiful as well. I love the pendant that you have.
Thank you. It is the emblem of southern France, the Counts of Toulouse. Yes, it's from there, so it's appropriate to wear it today.
Nice. I think that the first time I found out about you was when you just published your first book, and that was in 2016. And
Yes.
when I read your first book, it occurred to me that it was a nonfiction book about Templars, but it was a book like no other. And the reason for that was because you are an author like no other.
Oh my goodness. Thank you.
You're welcome. It occurred to me at the time that you are very open-minded and you are able to present the Knights Templar in a new novel way. So I want to encourage you to be the same way with me today, to be open-minded, courageous, and just feel free to unleash yourself and tell me and my viewers and readers how you see the Knights Templar and what wonderful discoveries you have made about them.
Thank you. I did come across Holy Blood, Holy Grail in the early 90s, long before you were born, I'm sure.
No.
And I read it, but I didn't connect with it because it was written in a journalistic fashion. But when I read Laurence Gardner's books, all of a sudden the content came to life as if they were real people, and I suddenly understood the human element. And I was so taken with his work that I pestered him endlessly, and eventually he gave me permission to set up a website in the USA. It's down now, and I did a bit of marketing for him in the USA, and he had listed me in his acknowledgments as my maiden name, Gretchen Schroeder, of course. I'm Cornwall now, but it filled the gap of why for myself. And honestly, right before I discovered his book, I'd had enough of every book on philosophy from around the world, alchemy, all of these medieval oddities, and I just couldn't put it together. And I had a dark night of the soul, and I actually gave hundreds and hundreds of books away, for which I now regret. And I felt guided, so I'll step off the academic path here. I'm very strong on academics and science, but I felt pushed. Go to the bookstore, go to the bookstore, go to the bookstore. Because what I couldn't get my head around was, what about our mystical European path, roots. Everybody's off running around finding gurus in India. They're running to China, but we're European. And I didn't want to sit on a floor cross-legged, and I don't mean any disrespect. I've learned a lot from those paths. I've learned a lot from yoga and handling the body, etc. And those paths are wonderful. But I wanted to know more about Europe's past. And it's directly keyed into of course, the Holy Land. And I went to this bookstore because I felt literally pushed, and I came across Laurence Gardner's first book, and then all the lights came on. All the lights came on. And of course, his content is about the bloodline of Christ. But in that narrative are the protectors of the Holy Grail. And for myself, the Holy Grail is many things. It is not only a woman, a very controversial woman, but it is also the individual human being, which is infused with the great divine, the more that you grow yourself as a person. But it's many things. And for some people, it's a physical cup as well. And I would not discount any of those options. But yes, that's how that came into being. And of course, the whole journey of the Templars on the Second Crusade, going on their mysterious journey there, occupying Temple Mount next to the palace where the king was. And for a fledgling order, just to drop this on you, why was a fledgling order with only 9 knights given access to the king's residence next door and given the most sacred of places in the Holy Land as their base? And of course, that has to go back to their sponsor, who is Bernard de Clairvaux, one of the great masterminds behind the Knights Templar. And not to discredit the first Grand Master, Hugh de Payen, at all, but they were certainly joined at the hip in launching this new endeavor. And as is a well-known saying now, Templars are Cistercians with swords. And of course, Bernard de Clairvaux rescued the flailing Cistercian abbey orders, and it only had 2 houses during his joining the Cistercian order at the age of 16. And he just rolled it out in a cookie-cutter, repeatable format across Europe and made it affordable. He made it affordable. He didn't require jewels and gold-encrusted and silks. In fact, he wore wool. He was very plain, very simple. And austere, and the focus was all on soaring architecture that helps lift up the mind, the soul, and fills the cathedrals and churches with light, natural light. Anyway, so that's probably too much information, but at that juncture, I wanted to know more about the Knights Templar, and I might be wrong about this, but I think I'm probably one of the few authors that has focused so much time on Bernard de Clairvaux, because when you start reading about this man, it's boggling what he actually did. It's impressive. I started off writing one book, and he just gradually took up more and more space, and it actually helps understand the Knights Templar even further.
Absolutely, yes. So. He was the soul behind the order.
He was an incredible individual. Truly earned his sainthood. Absolutely. Yes.
Do you think he sent them to Jerusalem to find something for him?
I do. That is the only way that they could have been given access to Temple Mount and the king. They had no track record. And they also were so controversial, because at that time, monks did not carry swords. They were not martial. You had to be 21 and already a knight and from a noble house in order to become a Knights Templar. So it was as if a doctor betraying his Hippocratic oath to only to heal, and in all honesty, he knew what he was doing. Bernard de Clairvaux knew what he was doing, because if you're going to go to the Holy Land, that's a tough ask. That's a tall order.
Oh, absolutely.
Especially at the Second Crusade, because Bernard de Clairvaux actually sent Eleanor of Aquitaine on the Second Crusade, and of course her husband, the King of France, and other nobles, because they were being attacked by outside forces. So you needed to be a marshal, the SAS of your day, in order to handle that environment. So, and to protect what they discovered. They had to get what they discovered eventually back to Paris, which was the headquarters of the Knights Templar, and of course Bernard de Clairvaux had a foothold there as well. So,
well, your first book, The Secret Dossier of a Knight Templar of Saint Graal, is a book about a mystery. It's a Templar mystery. Can you tell us more about the first book and what it's about and what propelled you to write it in the first place?
I wanted it to be a platform for future projects. So I covered quite a few bases, some very controversial. Some of the content could be looked at as mythical or legendary, but when it was written about, forgive me, I included Atlantis. That's very controversial. But when it was written about, I'm going to forget the fellow now. There were, of course, there was a Greek philosopher Plato, who wrote about it upon having visited the Library of Alexandria, where he discovered information written by the Egyptians saying they were at war with Atlanteans. And flash forward several centuries, there was I can't remember his name now, Acanthus Kircher, who who had a map of Atlantis and in the Atlantic Ocean as a very large continent. We don't know where he got it from. And what's interesting is that this map is correctly upside down, because the Nile runs from south to north. And so so the Egyptians viewed the upper, anyway, they looked at the world upside down to what we do today. So you see the geography. You have to take this map and literally flip it upside down, and it is in my book. You literally have to flip this map upside down to understand the geography of the European coast and the what I believe is the North America coast, and what I think is Nova Scotia. I think it's on there.
That's astounding.
So I believe that map highlights Nova Scotia.
Interesting.
So whether or not the size of Atlantis is correct, there is a microplate in the middle of the Atlantic that is small, but it certainly could have been Atlantis above water. So not to take things too far that direction, but I did cover a lot of ground. Obviously, the marriage between Mary Magdalene and Jesus, and about his earthly duties as being born into the house of David, a royal heir, and the clues and the very controversial indications that this marriage did take place. And of course, the Templar Knights coming across this information, or perhaps even knowing about it ahead of time and just going to retrieve information. It's my thought that Bernard de Clairvaux suspected the Ark and other information was there at Temple Mount. He was a scholar, he was well educated, and he would have been privy to the archival material that Rome had amassed at that time, and other scholars had amassed. So yes, it's a very large topic, and I threw every academic source at it I could possibly get my hands on to bolster my theories and the content. And I did meet a individual who was very interested in my book and wanted me to include information from his family background in the book, which I did do, and I gave him a fake name, John Temple, and he did not want to be a public figure, and he wanted to protect his broader family. So he has stepped back. And since coming out with this book and being on social media, especially Facebook, the numbers of people that have come forward and said, I have one or more Knights Templar in my background. So that's incredible. People who can actually trace their history back there to the Templars. They are walking history. They're living history because of the choices their ancestors made hundreds of years ago. And of course, the Templars are connected with great mysteries of the soul, of meditation, of prayer, that might be slightly off beam from the rules, the strict dogma of the day of the Catholic Church. And there was only one church. There was only one game in town, and everything centered on the church. There were no other options. I think we as human beings today, living in our Western world, would be quite shell-shocked to go back in time and live under such a strict, hierarchical, very heavily guarded culture.
Absolutely. Do you see Templars as protectors of secrets?
I do, and I think it was, of course, one of the reasons why they were brought down, because their initiations were never written about, and they were secret. And of course, as soon as there's a secret, everybody wants to, get in there and find out what's going on, and is it bad? And of course, this was, when the Templars were brought down, it was brought down by a secular, greedy, rather rotten monarch, absolute monarch. And
they rejected him, right? He wanted to be initiated into the order, and they said no.
He wanted to be the Grand Master.
Oh, yes.
And he wanted to have access to all of their expertise in fighting. He wanted their gigantic farms. They were one of the first successful corporate rollouts other than the Catholic Church itself. And the Templars, they were everywhere in Europe, and of course heavy in France, but they had, it wasn't just about keeping a man on a horse. They had massive farms, and they were making wine. They were embedded in their communities. They were the judiciary. They were rich. They were supporting life in the Middle East. And why wouldn't he want to have all of those resources under his umbrella? He was so heavily in debt to them, and his kingdom was, the people were starving. He was not popular. He had so many expensive wars going on. He just bankrupted his people. And there were riots happening, and it was one of these riots that caused him to seek shelter at the temple in Paris, their headquarters. And of course, that's well known. And it's possible at that moment, as they sheltered him that night, he realized how much they were actually worth. And it's a possibility. So, he was a dreadful man, and I do think that he significantly assisted Pope Clement in becoming elected. Philip had the prior pope kidnapped,
Right.
and he was rescued, but he died after being rescued a few days, and that
Probably
paved the way,
traumatized.
completely traumatized, and paved the way for Clement to be put into place. And at that point, the papacy was moved from Rome to Avignon, and remained there. The seat remained there for, I don't know, several decades, and those are literally called the exile years. So Philip had control of a pope, and overnight he became the de facto pope, the most powerful man in Europe. And I truly believe that Clement was illegally elected. And the Vatican should the papacy should never have been moved to France from its original location. So it paves the way for an incredible disaster of which we're all aware of. So
it sounds like King Philip IV thought himself unstoppable, invincible. Once you pull off something like that, kidnapping, Pope, getting a new one elected, basically your puppet, maybe.
Yes. And the year prior, 1306, he had stolen the wealth of the Jewish population in his kingdom and expelled them. And author, I believe it was Robinson, he stated he believed that Philip le Bel was afraid of Edward I, Plantagenet, who died July 1307 on the border between Scotland and England. And it was October of the same year that the Templars were arrested. So that is an interesting consideration, because the Templars were welcomed and supported and strengthened by Edward I.
Yes.
So it was Edward II who allowed 3 inquisitors into England, and a month after the arrests in France, he allowed the arrests in England. So
Edward II was the son-in-law of King Philip, right?
Yes, well remembered, and that's unfortunate. But what's also interesting is his son literally had to basically have his mother arrested and her lover, because there was a concern that he might be sidelined for their son. Perhaps Isabella might not have wished her son ill, but a potential son between her lover and could cause a problem for Edward III. And he actually took the property known as Royston Cave over almost forcibly, and remained the caretaker, the guardian of the old Templar preceptory in Royston. They owned, Baldock is the name of the church. The Templars owned all the property 8.5 miles all the way up to Royston Cave, and that was at a crossroads, and that's where their property ended. So the King of England took hold of Baldock Church, and through his agents, and up until I think it was Queen Victoria's reign, I might be getting this wrong, misremembering it, but it was up until about that time, around the early part of her reign, where it was the protectorship, if you will, was put to another body. But so there was something strange going on there, and of course, Edward III wanted to revitalize Camelot, and he had created the Order of the Garter. And it's quite a famous image of a wooden painted circle of the Round Table up in it, and it's massive, and it shows King Edward III in an Arthurian role. So the Templars have always been connected to Arthur, and Chrétien de Troyes is contemporary with Bernard de Clairvaux. They were around at the same time. So there is a deep connection between the Arthurian Knights and the physical manifestation on Earth as the Knights Templar. So,
do you think it was Bernard de Clairvaux who supplied information to Chrétien for?
I don't see why not. They both came from the north of what is now France. So, proximity is always something to look at. Proximity, yes, absolutely.
I'm speculating here, I know, but
yes, but if this were a crime, detectives would immediately go to who is in the general physical area, the same town, and is there a probability that these individuals might have known each other? And if the answer is yes, if they're close enough, then there may be more to those connections. So,
well, and if Bernard de Clairvaux knew some secret information that Templars brought to him from the Middle East, he could not have released it publicly. It had to be done in the form of literature.
Yes, and he was one of the players, if you will, movers and shakers of the Mariology movement, and also the courtly love. And of course, Eleanor of Aquitaine is the famous sponsor of that movement. But the two of them created a circumstance where women were elevated at last in the consciousness of the culture, from mere chattel to a position of greater respect, of protection, someone to be listened to. There was, around that movement, there was poetry, there was song, the arts flourished. It can't be compared to what we experience today in the Western world as women, but at the time it was light years away from what women had been experiencing up to that point. And Bernard de Clairvaux did get into a bit of trouble at one point. He said that because the same blood as Jesus in vitro flowed through him, it flowed through his mother, and therefore they were to be considered the same standing, the same level. And he had to backpedal on that one. But another interesting thing that he said, and he was in love with Mother Mary, but the other interesting thing is that there's great evidence he was in love with Mary Magdalene as well. He visited Speyer in Germany, and the cathedral there, he was so moved by this cathedral, which is dedicated to Mary Magdalene, that he gave them his crozier, his staff, and it is still there.
Oh, my.
So he has a deep connection to that cathedral. And of course there are some interesting issues with Germany, Magdeburg, for example, and their emblem is a young woman between two towers, holding up a sword in one hand and I think it might be a palm branch. I can't remember. So, you have this woman with a sword, and this tree of life, and of course Mary Magdalene Magdala means tower.
Yes.
So, so there's an interesting connection there between Germany and Bernard de Clairvaux. And he traveled a lot. He was constantly traveling when he could. So that is an interesting connection there with him.
So in 1307, Templars got arrested, thrown in dungeons, and in a few years after that, they were finished. Do you see them as an order that was finished and disappeared, or do you see them as escaping and starting a new life somewhere else?
Well, it's true that some of them did not escape. We know that for a fact, but they didn't get everybody. And I do think that they had a minimum of 1 month warning.
Okay.
Perhaps even longer. Philip le Bel's actions, when you work closely with someone, and Jacques de Molay, of course, was the Grand Master. His HQ was in Paris, just down the road from the palace where the king was living, and they were interacting and watching someone's demeanor, what they say, nuances. So I'm sure suspicions must have eked in. The replacing of the prior pope with Clement, all these things. There must have been something upstairs saying, I don't know if something's quite right.
Something's going on, yes.
Something's going on. But history is taught in modules in school of 45 minutes. And modules, because of the necessity of short time, often miss the connecting bridges. Okay, here are the Templars, but the bridge before and the bridge after aren't discussed.
Right.
And there are bridges before and after, and the development of how the Templars came into being and what happened to them afterwards. So, and this is true for any period of time in any of human history. So 1 month prior to the arrest, the king sends out a order, arrest the Templars on the morning of Friday the 13th October, which of course is where we get the unluckiest day of the year consideration. So the Templars were so embedded in their communities. They were merchants. Just as much as they were fighting men, they were merchants. And history views Templars as the guy on the horse, the man on the horse. Well, it takes 3 to 6 men to keep one man on a horse.
Yes.
And it takes backup resources. And it takes the farms in across Europe. I think at one point it said, there were only 20,000 Templars. So let's multiply that out by the 3 to 6 men who keep that man on the horse, and all the entire infrastructure in Europe. You could join the Templar order and find yourself as managing a farm. You could find yourself being in town, being part of the judiciary.
Right.
And never end up in the Holy Land. So people were coming to them for law, for holding safe their money, and they were given a bank draft, if you will, and they could pick their money up at the next station, the next preceptory, the next preceptory, all the way up until they get to the Holy Land, and they could be guaranteed they would get there. Human trafficking hasn't changed much, and we need to forgive me for jumping around. If you wanted to go to the Holy Land, chances are when you're on that ship out of Europe and heading across the Mediterranean, you could have your possessions stolen and be tossed overboard.
Oh, absolutely. So there was a lot of piracy too.
Yeah, absolutely. So protecting pilgrims on the route that's real.
Mm-hmm.
So, so once the Templars are established, and around 1119, 1120, starting with only 9 knights, coming back in victory to Europe and being hailed as heroes, and sons throwing themselves at the order to join. They grew. They were huge. They grew, and so the Templars are merchants. They're trading with the merchant guilds, and the philosophies of Templarism start eking into the general population base, and adopting sons comes from that. Someone who shows philosophical promise could be initiated. They doesn't mean that they're going to sit on a horse.
Right.
So you've got to ask the question, who is a Templar? Mm-hmm. And take Richard Lionheart, for example. He rode with them. He supported them extravagantly. And if you ride with the order for 2 years as a lay brother, and you go away with all of their teachings, perhaps even being initiated into the most sensitive parts of their philosophy, and they go back to their wife and their children, and this individual passes those disciplines on, who is a Templar? Mm-hmm. So it gets a bit foggy, mm-hmm. a bit hard to run down at that point.
Philip IV succeeded in arresting the majority of the key players in the Templar order, but the communities remained. The Templar towns and villages and mills, the people, the staff, they remained.
Yes, and they tipped off somebody along the way who was a Templar supporter, because this was just the ghastliest, most horrifying act that mm-hmm. could have ever been. The charges of heresy were just abominable and mm-hmm. obviously false. They used the same playbook against the Templars that were used against witches, women with herbal lore, older women that weren't pretty, and if you weren't pretty, therefore you were evil, all sorts of dreadful things. And of course, it's a great way to get rid of your political enemies. So, absolutely every deviant thought that could have been imagined was thrown at these men. And I just want to talk briefly, if you don't mind. This is often dismissed, this bit of evidence is often dismissed as inconsequential, circumstantial, coincidental. But the testimony of Sir de Chalon at trial, the comment is this that he made. Now this is his trial, and Templars were drilled to tell the truth, even if it meant your life. Yeah. And at this point, the Templars are hoping that the only man in the world that they owe allegiance to is the Pope. Will mm-hmm. at some point rescue them, and that this has all been somehow dreadful mistake. So he says at his trial, under testimony of oath, that Villiers de Chalon, a relative of his and a commander at Paris Temple, took 150 men on horse, 3 cartloads of gold and silver, and on the middle of the night of the 12th left the Templar preceptory mm-hmm. in Paris, and trying to make his way to the port of La Rochelle. Now, there was no way they were going to make it down there in time. It was too far away. Also, 150 men on horse with 3 carts on flagstones. You're going to hear that. Anybody mm-hmm. close to that wall, that massive wall protecting the perimeter of the compound, is going to hear it. So I believe that they were drawing off the king's men, and yes, they were captured. And nowhere does it say what happened. But if Templar odds are 3-1, can you imagine what the Kingsmen had to do to arrest that group of 150 Templars? And nothing is ever made about the treasure that King Philip attained. So it had to have been what I call spendable treasure, gold, silver. So he filled his coffers with that. But you know, the commandery was stripped. There was no big treasure. Most of the personnel were gone. So, and that would have taken a very long time to do. And key individuals probably got out along the river Seine, down the river to the port of Le Havre, and perhaps took ships there. Now that's controversial, but there were merchants and villages all the way on down the line of that river. And there would have been Templar merchant safe houses along the way. But, you know, they had time to get out, but they couldn't save everybody.
No.
They couldn't save, so they had to make the hard choice. Who do we sacrifice? You know, and there was no way they were going to beat the strongest standing army in Europe. They didn't have enough men, they didn't have enough time, so they got out who they could. And during the testimony, de Chalens says, La Rochelle, where Templars own 18 ships. Now that's often dismissed. Now, if you think about Acre or Aco in the Holy Land, Acre, which was the last stronghold of the Templars, they purchased Venetian vessels and sometimes rented them. And they were some of the best vessels around. So those Templar castles and fortresses on waterways had ships. Inland wouldn't have. So you know, you have to think about these things, and it's quite popular to say, oh well, no, they were landlubbers. No, they had their own ships, and that's what the strict testimony of Sir de Chalens said, and under oath, under strict Templar training, to such a level that we couldn't appreciate or understand today. We most of us would have collapsed under that training and said, I'm going home. This is too hard. So, you know, we have to take that into consideration. And those 18 ships went.
Where do you think they went?
I think they split up. I do think that some would have gone to Scotland. I think that's obvious. And of course, that there were Templars there already. Some may have gone to Portugal, and I think some went to Nova Scotia, the New World, because they knew it was there and they'd been going there already. So that's what I believe, is that the all indications, if you have 18 ships and the head of the order, if you will, has been cut off, they would have broken up to protect the order and to protect certain valuable information and objects.
So now that you have mentioned Nova Scotia, I want to tell people that you have appeared on the History Channel show The Curse of Oak Island. And on The Curse of Oak Island, you presented your own theory of what happened on Oak Island, the theory regarding the legendary treasure that's supposedly hidden here. I would like you to tell us how you got involved in The Curse of Oak Island, and of course explain the theory for those people who may not have seen that particular episode.
Well, how the mechanism for which I was invited into the virtual war room is rather convoluted. I was actually quite taken with Xena Halpern, and I just was blown away by her energy, her personality, her determination, and I just thought she was remarkable. So I actually worked quite hard to get in touch with her because I wanted to talk to her about her research and my own, because there were junctures where it did connect. And at last, I think Doug Kroll assisted with that, but also Judy Rudebush.
Yes.
Her researcher for 10 years. Somehow I managed to gain her trust. And she's quite the gatekeeper. And eventually I was given permission, access to speak with her. I did have 2 phone calls with her, for which I was quite grateful, and I just wished I'd had more time with her. And treasured those 2 phone calls. And it was through those contacts that eventually evolved into a war room, virtual war room meeting. And I honestly felt that the Nolan Cross was Templar, and I still believe that it is. And the theory that was presented that day was shown in part. The second half of the theory, which explained where we thought the money pit could be located, was actually edited out. And I believe that might have been due to proprietary information, non-disclosure agreement, because I didn't realize until afterwards, thinking on this has changed due to the archaeology that's been coming out of the ground over the last, in season 7. So one must always vet a theory with science, with facts.
Yes.
And that's what a theory is. Without science and facts, you have an opinion.
Right.
So they are two different. They're 2 different things. So theory is backed up by evidence until more evidence is brought in to either uphold the theory or to discredit the theory. And you must be flexible. So my thinking on the Money Pit and Nolan Cross has changed due to evidence coming out of the ground in season 7. So
I won't ask you anything that you might still present on the Curse of Oak Island. I expect you will be back in the future. So how about we talk about the artifacts that have already been discovered and shown on the show that definitely support your Templar theory? Are there artifacts from Oak Island that look like that they are medieval and Templar?
Yes, that in one case it's difficult. I just about fell to pieces when the lead cross at Smith Cove was discovered by Gary Drayton and Rick Lagina. I just about fell to pieces. Having lived in England for near to 18 years, I knew what I was looking at. And I just about fell out of my chair. I could hardly even think due to the ramifications of what that cross meant. Now, having been able to live in England for that long, I've seen thousands of graffiti marks of the Middle Ages, been through hundreds of churches and cathedrals and castles, and had a chance to visit, the museums where you can see objects of worship from medieval time periods. So I had a strong sense I was looking at a truly medieval cross from the time of the Templars. I knew what I was looking at, and sure enough, the dating that was done on it, and it came out of southern France.
Yes, close to Rennes-le-Château.
I was just beside myself. So the only thing that could be said about that is that it could have been brought there at a later date. I like to think that is not the case, but that's possible. Now, this is where it gets fun.
Okay.
In the early 90s, there were carbon fiber tests done on coconut fibers, carbon dating done on coconut fibers. According to legend, coconut fibers were found in copious amounts on the island.
Yes.
And 5 tests were done in the early 90s, and all of them tested to 1200 AD. Yes. And of course, the team on the island has also carbon dated testing from 1200, but it could have been potentially up to 1400, which is still incredible.
Yeah.
The kicker is this. Dr. Ian Spooner, doing his core drillings in the swamp,
yes,
when they found the pavement in the swamp, he was able to determine that the earliest intervention and which would be the pavement there, that very large, surface area, was 1220. So we have to start narrowing that conversation down to 1200. And that is Templar. That's Templar, period. And just briefly, it is my thought that the Nolan Cross is still Templar. I think Fred Nolan was correct, and that's being accepted through Dr. Ian Spooner's investigation of the swamp, that yes, it was 2 islands. So you've got 2 islands, and on the western island, you've got the 2 footstones of the Nolan Cross. The reason why that's important, to respect the ratio of this large monument, is it creates line of sight.
Yes,
line of sight is incredibly important in medieval church building, castle building, and the Templars were phenomenal engineers, or they were able to leverage phenomenal engineers. So you have line of sight that takes you across the water right to the headstone or the skullstone. And that is hugely important. Where it gets dicey is this, and I'm working on this one. I have a new publication coming out from my research over the last few years. Did the Templars carve the face, the skull, and the sword? If they did, then it is not an indication of the swamp. It has to be a false footing, and that there is a very sacred, important treasure hidden elsewhere other than the money pit. And the reason why I say this, okay, as you know, the money pit, the swamp, I'll backtrack. The sword on the headstone creates a compass, a medieval compass. And the face is faced towards the swamp.
Yes.
In line with the compass that the sword creates. And of course, the compass is incredibly important again for medieval building. And flash forward to the Freemasons, who draw inspiration from medieval building techniques. The compass, of course, is incredibly important. So all of the archaeology coming out of the money pit era stops in the 17th century. The dendrochronology, those hand-hewn beams coming out of the ground. So far, they have not shared with us that any of those beams coming out of the ground are 1200. So we've got layered activity.
Yes.
It indicates that Oak Island is a vault that had been repeatedly visited, and the knowledge of that island had been passed down the centuries. And that the Francis Bacon theory could be accurate when it comes to the money pit, but it doesn't support Templar activity. Therefore, if the Nolan Cross is Templar, which I believe it is, there's a treasure elsewhere on the island that's not yet been established or discovered. And I think there are multiple caches on the island. So I'm still working on that one. Mm-hmm. But we're looking at repeated visits, repeated interments, withdrawals, and interments in other places, perhaps even as many as 6 caches. Mm-hmm. So forgive me for going into all of that. But I know that some people, may I interject this?
Yes.
Since we're talking about Templars, there are a lot of people that view Xena Halpern's map as suspicious, as a fraud. As a historical document, and I do believe it's historical, but of what period, that might be questionable. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. If it is medieval, of course, the writing on it, the drawing on it, that is not medieval. We have to accept that. So it's a working map that has been repeated down the centuries, not a museum piece to glorify a nobleman who is supporting a scribe, if you will. You know, mm-hmm. Medieval documents, manuscripts, they were expensive, and they were often sponsored works. Where the secular lord gave money to a scribal center in an abbey to create either a map, and everything had to do with religion. So the sponsor's name was always on the map somewhere. There was mm-hmm. always, thank you note somewhere. So up in the top right-hand corner, what do we have? The Rochefoucauld name.
Yes.
All right. And in the lower right-hand corner, which is secondary, you have another sponsor. So we're looking at the remains of a document that probably no longer exists, or right. It's in an archive somewhere and nobody knows they've got it. And somebody copied it repeatedly over the years. So whether or not this is a fraud, and I don't believe that it is. I believe that it is possible that the language is slang, mm-hmm. That these anomalies, I myself wanted to investigate. Xena believed it was real, mm-hmm. and I wanted to investigate the content on the map, and yes. perhaps by doing that, come to some further evidence that it may or may not be a historical document. So the lower right hand corner had been translated I believe by Nicola Lewis, who works with the team and who was at Rochefoucauld Chateau with the team, with Rick Lagina and his nephew and friend. The lower right hand corner says simply young lion of Talmont, and of course the South Indians work well, which of course in itself is problematic. So we'll handle that another time. Right now I'm focusing on the name Talmont and the fish, and I believe I may have the fish pegged, but just briefly. In February 2018, I wrote a blog about Talmont, about this. It's on my website. I came across a knight who is relevant to Xena's map with the date of 1347. Oh, and by the way, the date 1347 dovetails with Royston. That date is on the cave itself. So there's a connection from Royston to Talmont Castle in France. When I went there in the summer of 2018. And there is a young lion of Talmont from 1347 who owned that castle, Talmont. Mm. And his coat of arms, his heraldry, his helm shows stag antlers and a lion rampant. And he was a very well-respected, skilled knight. And he fought in the Battle of Poitiers, and of course that was 1356, and of course, unfortunately, the French lost. But The Battle of Calais, when the port of Calais was taken by the English, I might be getting the date wrong, 1326. You're not going to be able to leave France by that port anymore, but you could leave by France at Talmont. And the Templars were there as well. The Templars had been given land there by Eleanor of Aquitaine. Mm-hmm. So you had you had the usual suspects. You had Templars, and you also had Lord Tours, Louis I de Tours. So the young Lion of Talmont, we don't know that he didn't take vessels or went with the Templars on their own vessel to North America. He earned that moniker somewhere, Young Lion.
Mm-hmm. Can I take you back to the discoveries on Oak Island that point to the 1200s? The paved area in the swamp dates back to the 1200s. The coconut fibers were also tested to be from the 1200s. Yes. That's a long time before 1307. So what do you think about that? Did Templars come to Oak Island, do something maybe on a journey of exploration or discovery, rather than running away, looking for exile in 1307? Because that changes things, yeah. the time when they would come. I'll
try to keep this short. They knew it was there. That's why they went there. And the reason why they knew it was there is because what we call the Vikings had been there as well. Mm-hmm. There is an acknowledged settlement. It's a UNESCO heritage site in Newfoundland, and that has been termed as a vessel repair station. That is unique in itself. Why do you have a vessel repair station unless you are supporting a larger population base or incoming vessels? Yes. So that settlement was supporting incoming, outgoing vessels. And there is evidence of the Vikings further south into Boston, Massachusetts. Much of that is legendary. But the archaeologist Josh Gates, who has his own program, he's so fun. He's quite strict on science first. But he actually corroborated a boulder, which is now underwater off the shore of Boston, that has Viking inscriptions on it. Mm-hmm. It was photographed in the 1930s, but the water level rose, and now that boulder is underwater. But they went there, they found it, they took off the buildup of ecology and verified that there was Viking writing there. So I do think that the Vikings knew of Oak Island. Mm-hmm. And the Newfoundland station was dated to the year 1000 AD. Now think about this. The Duke of Normandy Norsemen. Yeah. He was the last greatest Viking. He was of Norse ancestry. The Dukes of Normandy were given the county, the duchy, by the King of Paris because Paris had been raided twice. Yes. And they needed to keep the Vikings out of Paris. So what better thing to do? Get one of these guys, the toughest, meanest, baddest one, make him a duke, which is, one step away from being a prince, marry him off to the princess, yes. And you've civilized him in one go and helped him become invested in the kingdom. So fast forward a few hundred years to 1066, and he has made a treaty, the Duke of Normandy, William the Conqueror, with Norsemen, his cousins. Yes. They go to York, draw off King Harold, which he has to hightail it up to York, protect York, while Duke William invades England. So these poor men have to run back south to then fend off William the Conqueror, and they fail. So it's that juncture that the Viking raids cease, because at that point they have become royalty. They have been established in York for a few hundred years. They're in the community already, and they are now integrated into the fabric of Romano-Britain and Anglo-Saxon Britain, and establishing a new era of French intervention. So, long story short, there's not a lot of a leap from the year 1000 AD to 1066. That's living memory, isn't it? So you now have a high probability of 1066 leaping forward a few generations to 1120, Bernard de Clairvaux's time, and they've absorbed and had that information passed down to them. And Bernard de Clairvaux was born in northern France, in the next county over from Normandy. So there is proximity there. I am still working on those historical ties, but they knew it was there. And I have other bits of evidence as well that I won't discuss here, but I have other evidence that ties the Rochefoucauld family into Nova Scotia and North America, so that I don't want to disclose here. But they also have a tie to the Mary Magdalene story as well, quite a strong one. So they are a major player, and there is a marriage between Talmont Castle and that family with the Rochefocaulds in 1099. And the Rochefoucauld Castle has quite a few Templar churches in the area, and I will be bringing that up in the book. I went there and photographed one of these Templar churches. So it's quite convoluted, but there is quite a bit of strong evidence that the reason why the Templars were there in 1200 is because they knew it was there already, and they'd already been there. They didn't just think, oh, well, let's just head east and see what we can see. That's nuts. That nobody in their right mind would do that. And they would have inherited the navigation capacity of the Norsemen.
Yes.
And perhaps even the navigation tool, the Sunstone. And in my first book, I discuss Pierre de Méricourt, whose paper on the magnetic properties of the lodestone were used up until the early 1700s. So combine Pierre de Méricourt, who also has connections through nobility and Templars. So you've got the Viking Sunstone, which has been proven accurate in navigation and a connection to the Templars, and you have Peter de Méricourt with the magnetic early compass. So they have navigation skills, navigation tools, and the knowledge of the Vikings going back to 1000 AD. My thought on this, and this is where I'm going to step into deep waters, but it's something to consider. If the Templars felt that they had found significant artifacts under Temple Mount, there were 9 knights. They dug for 9 years under Temple Mount, took what they had back to Europe, and became famous overnight. Why? Because they had something significant, which was not shared with the general public. It's possible they had the Ark of the Covenant, and if there is now there are 2 ways of approaching the Ark of the Covenant. It was a solely divinely created object, which could be awoken, if you will, spoken through, perhaps even called this group to, the Templars to Temple Mount with instructions to take it and take it away. And then, of course, stepping into wider waters, which may be controversial to some of your people, there is the ancient aliens group that view the Ark as a device of high technology that was gifted to the Israelites on Mount Sinai with the Ten Commandments. And so, you have these two really big ideas which might challenge some individuals. But if they wanted to take something very special, it may have stayed in Paris for a while. It may have been interred in another cathedral nearby, which I cannot speak about. That's proprietary information for another situation. But they could have decided to take it to where absolutely nobody would be looking for it and create an outdoor cathedral that was also a signpost as to where it was interred. So, and not meant to be retrieved until called upon again. Well, so it's possible.
If I may say something about the Ark of the Covenant, from the description of how it was used in the Old Testament, it was also used as a weapon of mass destruction. People who approached it and didn't know how to follow the proper protocol developed a disease and died. Yeah. So it's a dangerous object.
It is, and you had to be a priest of the tribe of Levi, and they were the only ones that were allowed to handle it. If there is, and this is my thought, if we look at the ancient alien side of it, if it is encoded with their DNA, because we're getting into biotechnology now. And if this can be triggered with biotechnology, like a password, is it possible that there might be a strain of that tribe in a Templar family? Or did they meet with a descendant was there a confluence of events where they met with a priest from the tribe of Levi and they found themselves serendipitously or synchronistically meeting and went together, but with instructions either divinely or through another mechanical mechanism that it needed to be removed and taken elsewhere. This is kind of interesting to note. There is a very high level of uranium on the island. Now, Dr. Travis Taylor said that it was naturally occurring. That's very possible.
It's all over Nova Scotia.
I certainly wouldn't question a scientist of his standing, but is there another reason for it? And of course, the Ark, the description of people having been killed by it and as a weapon of mass destruction speaks of radiation, radiation burns, death by radiation, sickness. So it's big stuff, but these things, who knows? The Templars thought they had something so important. They were ready to keep it secret. They were ready to die for it. They were ready to use their training, their martial skills and ability. They could be trusted. You could trust the Templars to take you from Europe, a very difficult journey, all the way to the Holy Land. Sometimes it was a one-way ticket, and you never were going to get back. You could trust them with your life. And that's saying an awful lot at that time. And you could trust them with your money. Everybody trusted them. That doesn't mean to say they were perfect. There's a phrase, drunk as a Templar. But the problem with that is everybody was drinking at that time. different alcoholic levels of beer because the water wasn't safe.
No,
so everybody
it was not. No, everybody drank wine or mead.
Everybody was slightly off their, off their rocker at that time. So just to what level are we talking about? So, there were times they did get into trouble. They did charge high interest. And I'm sure that not everybody that was in the order was a good person. And in any organization, you have that. An organization is made up of its people. And it's up to the people involved in the organization to keep the tenets of that organization pure,
sure,
as much as is humanly possible.
Mm-hmm.
So I do think that they were mining for gold there. Xena was the one who figured this out. Just north of Oak Island is Gold River.
Yes. Yes.
So, they were fabulously wealthy, and if they had a secret stash, a source,
mm-hmm.
of course they were going to exploit it. Of course they were. So,